So now we know how to output data. In modern web applications, that's only half of what you do though. You also need to react to user input. You need to react to events. You want to make dynamic pages. After all, this is one of the main reasons for using a framework like Vue. It makes building highly reactive and dynamic web applications easier. Therefore, that's what we're going to focus on next, and attached you find a simple starting project which is not too different from the one before. We just have a slightly different content. Still got a section with a different ID now, and in there we got two buttons, add and remove. We also have a paragraph where I output a counter which is managed in this Vue app which is created for you already. It's a very simple Vue app here, as you can tell. Pretty empty, just has this data method where I return my data, which only consists of a counter in the end, which is a number starting at 0, and I mount this to the events section, which is this section that holds all that markup. Now at the moment those buttons don't do anything. If I press them, you'll see that, well, nothing happens. And that's exactly what we want to work on. I want to show you how you can react to user input and how you now can really leverage Vue to make a more interactive and reactive web application. Let's say when this button, the add button, when this button is pressed, we want to add 1 to the counter. When the remove button, or reduce maybe, when the reduce button is pressed, we want to deduct 1 from the counter. Let's start with the add button. How could we do that? In regular JavaScript, we would get access to the button with document get element by ID if that button had an ID, or with query selector and selecting the first button we find. And we could add an event listener with the add event listener method. That is how we would do it in vanilla JavaScript without Vue. But we're using Vue so that we don't have to do it like this, so that we don't have to define step by step what should happen, but that we instead can leverage this declarative approach and just declare our end result and let Vue figure out how to get there. And therefore, thankfully, Vue gives us an easier way of adding event listeners to HTML elements. If we want to add a click listener to this button, we can use another Vue directive. We learned about vbind. Vbind is helpful for setting the value of an attribute. Now for adding event listeners, we have another directive, and that's the von directive, because we want to react on a certain event. von takes a so-called argument after a colon, just like vbind took the attribute which should be bound. von takes the event to which you want to listen after the colon. In this case, click. Now, in case you're wondering to which events you can listen, well, all the default events you can listen to on HTML elements. So that would be click, mouse enter, mouse leave, really anything you can listen to in vanilla JavaScript as well. Here, it's the click to which I want to listen. And then after an equal sign between the opening and closing double quotes, we now specify the code that should run when the click occurs. And that could be counter ++, which is the shortest form of writing in JavaScript that we want to add 1 to the counter. And that's just JavaScript code, nothing Vue specific. As with vbind and the double curly braces, you can have simple JavaScript expressions right here in your HTML code in the parts that are managed by Vue, like here with von. If I now save that and reload, I can click add, and you will see that the counter gets bigger every time I click this button, thanks to this code. Now try doing, well, basically the same, just with reducing the counter on this button. Were you successful? Well, of course, it shouldn't be too difficult. It's essentially the same code. We want to react to a click event with von click, and then here we just have counter --, or the longer form would also work, of course. It's totally up to you what you write there. With that, you can also reduce the counter. So now we can add and reduce. And that's pretty nice. And this is how we can listen to user events in Vue. And here's one super important thing which is easy to overlook, which shows us why we use Vue and how powerful Vue is. You might notice that we don't have much code here. Some HTML code and definitely not a lot of JavaScript code. I mean, this here is all the JavaScript code we wrote. Yet we have 2 event listeners and a counter that changes, and most importantly, and easy to overlook, we got a counter that's being output here where the page the user sees changes every time the counter changes. This -6 here changes to a -5 if I click the button. And that's not something which would normally happen in a web page. You would need to write JavaScript code that adds event listeners, changes the counter, and then when the counter changes, reaches out to that paragraph to change the value that's showing up there. And that's exactly what Vue does behind the scenes for you. That is the core asset of frameworks like Vue. You just declare where you want to have event listeners and where you want to output values and which values Vue should be aware of. And Vue does all the rest of adding and managing those listeners, updating the counter behind the scenes, and most importantly, detecting when the counter changes and updating the parts of the real rendered page where updating is needed when that counter changes. This is what Vue does behind the scenes. This is a core feature of Vue, this built-in reactivity. It detects that the counter changes when you click a button, and it then finds the places on the page where the counter is used to update what the user sees with JavaScript behind the scenes. I'm really emphasizing this because it's so important to understand what Vue does here and hopefully why that's pretty amazing and makes our life as a developer much, much easier. Well, and that's how we can get started with events in Vue. Now let's see what else we can do with them. Now we learned how to listen to events. Now here's one important thing. Currently, I'm updating the counter here in my HTML code. In the Vue controlled parts, but in the HTML code. And it generally is considered a bad or not optimal practice to do that. You don't want to put too much logic into your HTML code. Instead, the HTML code should really just be about outputting stuff. Logic like this, even though it's not too complex, should typically go into your JavaScript code. Now, how could we get this logic into our JavaScript code? Well, we want to do something on every click. What do you typically use if you want to do something at a certain point of time, potentially in a repeated way? Well, you need a function that can be called. You need a function which you can call when the add button is clicked, and you need a function which you can call when the reduce button is clicked. Now, of course, we could specify a function here, add, and there try to set counter equal to counter plus 1. But for multiple reasons, this wouldn't work. For one, counter is not a globally available variable. It is a data property, hence it's not available here. In addition, even if it would be available for whatever reason, add now is a globally created function, but in your Vue-controlled HTML code, you can't use such a function. You can only use in this Vue-controlled HTML part what is defined in your Vue app. And that's why we use methods for that. And we did already learn about methods before. Now, we don't just use methods to manually call them as we did before. We can also use methods to connect them to event listeners and let Vue call them for us when a certain event occurs. For example, here we can add an add method, though this name here is totally up to you. You could also name it add counter or increment or whatever you want, but I'll name it add. And in here, you can now update this counter. Just important, as you learned, with this counter. In your JavaScript code, you refer to your data properties with this. This counter plus plus, or the longer form this counter equals this counter plus 1, it's the same. And with that, we have a method which we can call to update our counter. Now, this method doesn't return anything because it doesn't have to. We'll not use the method like we did before to dynamically output something here. Instead, we're using it to run it when a click occurs. And therefore, this doesn't need to return anything because the click listener doesn't want a return value. So now here, we can call add like this. And if I now save that and reload, I can click add and it still works because we're executing the same code just in a different way. And this is actually the better way of doing it. Putting your logic into JavaScript and just pointing at that logic, that is generally considered better, even though technically it here works in the same way. But consider cases where you have more complex logic, and it quickly makes sense that you should put that logic into JavaScript and not into HTML, so it's not bad to get started with that as a habit right from the start. Now, besides calling add like this, by the way, you can also just point at it, so that you tell Vue, hey, that's the name of the function, or of the method to be precise, you should execute when a click occurs. Vue accepts both. You explicitly calling it like this, or you pointing at it. Vue detects what you're doing and it will do the right thing in both cases. Now, typically you just want to point at it, since that is closer to vanilla JavaScript and how you would set up an event listener there, but it is worth noting that both syntaxes are allowed, as you can see here. Well, and now let's do the same for reducing our counter. Of course, try this on your own. Here's a quick pause for you to do that, and thereafter we'll do it together. Were you successful? Well, again, it's pretty much the same code. We can add a reduce method. Again, this name is up to you. And in there, we just set this counter equal to this counter -1, or we use the shorter form, which looks like this, which is also okay. And now in here, on this second button, we can call reduce like this, or as I just mentioned, just point at it. Both is accepted. And now we got our working buttons with one important change. Now the logic is outsourced into JavaScript, which is where your logic should be, and the HTML code is leaner. And this is better. This is considered to be better, so it is a good idea to get started with this approach and with this pattern. Now, that is how we can use methods. We can not just use them in curly braces or with vbind to dynamically derive a value we want to output, but we can also use them with event listeners to define code that should be executed when the event occurs. And in reality, you will more often use methods to connect them to events than you will use them to output something dynamically derived. I just showed this before to show you that it's possible and to introduce methods, but typically you'll use them like this in combination with event listeners. Okay, so we learned quite a bit about events. What if we now don't just want to add 1 and subtract 1, but we want to be able to add 5 and reduce this by 5? Maybe name it subtract therefore, whatever you want. But the goal is that we now don't just add and deduct 1, but instead 5. How would we do that? Well, we of course could accept a parameter in those methods, right? That is how we would probably do it in JavaScript. We can accept the parameter, number or num or n, totally up to you. It's your method, so you can accept whatever you want. And then we could add num here or reduce num. Of course, we could also make this less dynamic and just hardcode 5 here. The problem just is that whenever we plan to change this number, we need to change it down there in code. So it typically would be better to have a more dynamic method which gets the number which we want to add or remove and then uses this as a parameter like this. Then these methods will never need to be changed when we decide to deduct or add a different number. So that's the more generic and therefore typically better way of writing these methods. But how do we tell View that it should call add and reduce with a value of 5 for these parameters? Well, keep in mind, we can execute add like this by pointing at it or by calling it explicitly. Well, and if we call it like this, we're, as a developer, in full control over the value we want to pass to the parameters of these methods. So here we can add 5, for example, and reduce by 5, just like that. And now whenever we decide to go for a new value, we just have to change it here in HTML, where we're changing the caption of the button anyways, and the method will work correctly automatically because it's written in a very generic way. So if we now save that and reload, I can add 10 and subtract 5, and it just works. So passing arguments to methods is also possible, and it's very easy to do. And this is an important pattern to know. This is important to understand because in reality, in apps you're building with Vue, you will sometimes have the scenario that your method needs to get some parameter, which you as a developer want to set. And as you see, setting it and telling Vue to call this method with this value is super easy. So this is taking shape. Let's now enhance this mini dummy app here a little bit. And let's add an input of type text here, just like this. And below that a paragraph where I say your name. And in here I want to output the username, but now the user should be able to enter the name in this input here. And that's the new thing. So we can have a name field here in our data. Initially it could be empty or your name, whatever you want. And we can output the name here with the double curly braces. But now I also have this input here, and whenever I type in here, I want to update the name which is output in this paragraph. Now how could we do that? Well, now that we learned about listening to events, we should have all the tools we need for that. We can add an event listener with vOn, and now of course I don't want to listen to the click event, but to every keystroke. We could do this with key up or key down, which all have their special behaviors. The best event to listen to on an input HTML element is the input event, which is a default DOM event available on input elements. Nothing Vue specific, you can listen to the input event in vanilla JavaScript as well. Here with vOn, I'm telling Vue that I want to listen to this input event on this input element. And therefore now, again, we can specify the code between these double quotes that should execute when an input event is emitted, which will be the case on every keystroke. That is how the input event is emitted by default. So now again, we could put the code in here or use this better approach of using a method. So I'll do that, add a little method here, set name could be the method name because that's what we're going to do. Again, the name is up to you, but of course you want to name the method such that it describes what it's going to do. So here I'll use set name. And then I want to set this name, so this name property, which we added to our data object, equal to what the user entered. And that's going to be a bit tricky, won't it? Because how do we know what the user entered? We know that the user entered something because we're listening to that event, but how do we get the concrete value the user entered? Well, there is a built-in behavior built into JavaScript, not into Vue, which we can leverage. First of all, we can point at the setName method here, which is the method we want to execute on every keystroke. And now there's a cool behavior in JavaScript, not in Vue. Vue just also is able to use it. When you add an event listener and you then point at a function that should be executed when that event occurs, that function will automatically get one argument. The browser will ensure that this argument is provided, so to say. And that will be an object describing the event that occurred. So here in setName, we can accept this one argument, this one parameter. You can name it however you want, but you will always get this by the browser. We would have gotten this here for add and reduce as well. We just overrode it with our own custom argument we're passing in. But since I'm not executing setName with parentheses here, but I'm pointing at it, I don't override it, and I let the browser provide this default event object. And why is this useful? Because this default event object will be full of information about the event. And for example, it will give us information about the HTML element on which this event occurred, which is the input element. And we can then read the current value stored in this input from that input element. And we get access to the target of the event with event.target. And that's vanilla JavaScript. This is nothing Vue specific. This would work in vanilla JavaScript as well. This gives us access to the element on which the event occurred. And this is the input element in this case, which will have a value property. Again, that's just vanilla JavaScript. And you can search for MDN input to find more documentation on this input element. And in here, you will eventually somewhere find that this has a value property which you can use to read what the user entered. So this will be the value the user entered. setName will be called on every input event, so on every keystroke. And this should update the name, our data property here, with every keystroke with the value the user currently entered here. And then we're outputting name down there. And if we now save that and reload, I can enter Maximilian and you see how this updates in the paragraph below. And that's Vue's reactivity in action again. It allows us to listen to this event and execute this code, and it then also detects that name changed and updates it in the places on the page where updating is needed. And as a side note, if I inspect this here in the Chrome DevTools, there is something other interesting which we can notice. If you watch this part on the right here, this HTML code, you'll see that the parts that are re-rendered by the browser flash. You see the paragraph with my name flashes. Now you will also see that nothing else on the screen flashed. For example, the counter didn't flash. This counter only flashes if I change the counter. Now these are the parts which are actually re-rendered on the screen. And you see that only the parts that really changed in code are re-rendered on the screen. And that's important. If Vue would update the entire screen whenever something changed somewhere, this would be bad for performance. Instead, Vue is really smart and it sees that with every keystroke here, only the name changes, and hence it only finds the places where I use the name, in this case this paragraph, and updates that. And the rest is, well, left untouched, and hence we save performance or have a better performance. Now, this is how we can work with events. There's just one more note about this default event object. You could have a scenario that you need to call your method explicitly on your own here, as we did it with add and reduce. For example, because you need to pass in some other argument, like a second name, which I always want to use here. We could accept this here, second name or last name, and then update name with whatever the user entered plus last name. Maybe also add a white space in front of it. The problem with that is that we now no longer get this default event object as a first argument here. Now, to still pass that in, there is a special variable which you can use here in your template, and that's $event. This is a reserved name, and Vue gives this variable to you to give you access to this built-in default event object, which you get automatically by the browser, so that you can use it here in this code as well, and for example, still pass it in as a first argument to setName if you wanted to. So whenever you find yourself using an argument here, or you simply can't just point at a function for whatever reason, and you need that built-in event, you can access it with $event. But again, this is only needed if you're not just pointing at the method as we did it before. Hence now if I reload, this still all works as before, but now with help of $event. That's just another side note because sometimes this is exactly what you need to get access to both the built-in event object you get automatically and still execute code on your own explicitly, for example, to pass in your own arguments. Now that we got the basics about events down, let's talk about event modifiers, which is another useful feature built into Vue. Here's an example for an event modifier that can sometimes be useful. Let's say you had a form HTML element, in there you had some input, and you had a button that says sign up, whatever. If you reload, you have that here. Now the problem you'll have by default, if you leave it like that, even if it's in the view controlled HTML part, is that when you click this button, this page will reload. And the reason for that is that the browser default for a form with a button like this is to submit that form and send a HTTP request to the server serving this app. In this case, we have no such server. We're running this locally, but still, the browser simply sends a request to our local machine, therefore, you could say. Now, of course, we have no code in place to handle this request. Now, we'll get there later in this course. But typically with frameworks like Vue, you want to prevent this browser default, and instead you want to handle this manually in JavaScript with help of Vue in your Vue app. And you want to read the user input there, validate it, and then send it manually to a backend server and store it in a database, for example. So you want to prevent that browser default of automatically sending it. Now there are two ways of doing that. One of them is cool, and the other one is, well, more obvious, I would say. You can listen to the submit event here, which again is a default browser event to which you can listen on form elements. Then we could have a method here, submit form, like this, at which we can point here, submit form. Now we're telling Vue that whenever the form is submitted, submit form should be executed. And here we could do whatever we want, for example, show an alert, submitted. Now, right now, the problem is that we still have the browser default. If I click this, I get the alert, but the page reloads thereafter. And when the page reloads, that means we'll lose all our data, right? If I had a counter here and I click sign up, you'll see that all the data is lost because of the page reload, the Vue app restarts, so to say. So we haven't solved the problem. But remember that we get this default event object. I talked about that in the last lecture. Now we can call prevent default on that. This is a default browser mechanism. It's built in JavaScript, which is totally independent from Vue. Even if we just used vanilla JavaScript on that default event object which we get, we could call prevent default. And this would tell the browser that the form should not be submitted, that we don't want that browser default. So now if I reload, I can change my counter, click sign up, we see the alert, and the counter still is there because now that browser default has been prevented. This works, and there's nothing wrong with it, but Vue has a nicer way for us. We can remove all that code and instead use a so-called event modifier. There are certain built-in modifiers which you can connect to events you're listening to, let's say, to change that event behavior. And you add such a modifier with a dot after the event name after vOn. So vOn colon, then the event name, and then a dot if you want a modifier. Now, there are only a couple of supported modifiers. You can find a full list in the official docs. For example, there is a prevent modifier. And this modifier, which is built into Vue, will prevent the browser default. So it will basically do what we did manually a second ago, just with less code. There also is a stop modifier for stopping propagation, but here we need the prevent modifier. And with that, if we reload, I can click sign up, we see that alert, and still the page doesn't reload thanks to this modifier. So that's nice to know, and that will come in handy later. We don't just have such event modifiers to change the event and browser behavior, we also have modifiers we can connect to events to change when the event occurs. And one example would be our buttons. Let's say for whatever reason, we only want to subtract 5 if the user right-clicks on the button. The default, of course, is to react to a left click. But if we wanted to react to a right click, we could add a modifier here as well. And we can set it to right. Alternative values are left, which you don't need to specify because it's the default, middle, and, well, right. And this tells Vue that here, you only want to react to a right click. So when you're using a mouse event like click, you can use the right, left, and middle event modifiers to change which mouse button triggers this event. So if we now save this, you see I can add 10 by clicking with the left key. But if I click on subtract 5 with the left key, nothing happens. If I use the right mouse button though, which you can tell I'm doing because my context menu opens up, now the counter gets smaller. Of course, we can argue whether that's useful here, but it's definitely useful to be aware of those modifiers. And there's a last kind of modifiers, and that would be key modifiers when you're listening to keyboard events, like here on the input element. Currently, we're updating the name upon the input event here, so on every keystroke. Now let's say we want to update the internally stored name, so this name property, with every keystroke, but the name that's being output here should only be updated when the user hits enter on this input element. Well, for that, we could have another data property, confirmed name, which is the actual name we want to output here. So here we got the confirmed name in this paragraph. And the confirmed name, unlike the internally stored name, which is just named name, the confirmed name should only update here when the user hits the enter button in this input field. For that, we can add another event listener on the input element. Yes, you can have more than one. So here we're listening to input with vonInput. Now I'll add another von directive and also listen to the key up event, which is triggered when a key is pressed and released again. And here I want to trigger a method which I have yet to add, which I'll call confirm input or confirm name, whatever you want. The goal here in confirm input is to set this confirmed name, so this new data property we added, which we're outputting in this paragraph, set this confirmed name equal to the internally stored name, which we update with every keystroke. So here, von key up, I want to point at confirm input. Now currently this would fire whenever any key is pressed and released. So currently if I reload here, we would basically have the same behavior as before. With every keystroke, the input event, but then also the key up event is triggered, and therefore we basically confirm the input with every keystroke. So that's probably not the final behavior we want. Instead, we can use another modifier with a dot here to tell Vue that since this is a keyboard event, we only want to trigger this event upon certain special keys that are pressed and released. For example, the enter key. You could also listen to control or shift or page down. All keyboard keys are possible here, but I want to listen to the enter key. And with that, I'm saying, hey, when the enter key is pressed and released, then confirm input should be executed. So now if I save that and reload, I can enter Maximilian here, and we see nothing in that green box. But if I place my cursor in here and hit enter, now we see that output here. So these are event modifiers. Now I'm quickly going to auto format this HTML code with the format document key combination here in Visual Studio Code to make this more readable, but it's the same code as before, just structured differently. So that's the input we just worked on. We have the input event and the key up event with the enter modifier to change when confirm input executes. Now to conclude this introduction to events, which is another core feature as you can clearly tell, let me show you one other directive which you will very rarely need, but which sometimes in niche scenarios could be helpful. Let's say for whatever reason, here in this app, we want to make sure that when we change the counter here, the output here doesn't change, so that the initial value of the counter is preserved here. Now you might wonder why we might want to do that. Let's say we have another paragraph where we simply output the starting counter value, and we want to point at the counter property we're managing in our view instance, so that if we ever change it here, we do reflect that correct starting counter here. But we want to make sure that the starting counter never changes. And right now, of course, since we reference counter, it will change whenever we change the counter. If you have such a scenario that you have some data that changes and you want to preserve the initial state and not reflect any other changes, there is a special directive you can put onto the element where you are using that dynamic value in. And that's the v_once directive, which is built into Vue. This tells Vue that any dynamic data bindings, like this interpolation here, on this element should only be evaluated once. So if that value changes thereafter, here in this place, it'll not be reflected, it'll not be updated. So now if I reload, we see the starting counter 10 here, but if I change the counter, it only changes down there in the second green box and not in the first one. Now again, this is a niche feature, but it is useful to be aware of it if you ever had a scenario like this where you need to lock an initial value in. v_once can help you with that. So now it's time to put our newly gained knowledge on events into practice. And for that, attached you find a simple assignment project, some starting styles, empty app.js file, and some content in index.html. And in this index.html file, you also find your assignment instructions. Task number 1 is that you should show an alert when this button here is pressed. Now, the alert can hold any text you want, but the goal simply is to react to this button being pressed and then, well, show the alert. Task number 2 also obviously is related to events, but to a different event. Here, I want you to listen to the key down event on this input here. And whenever that occurs, I want you to basically update what's showing here in the paragraph. And you should output the value the user entered. So output the user input in this paragraph and update it on every key down event. Hint, event target value will help you with that. The third task is basically the second task, but with an important difference. I want you to repeat what you did in task number 2, but now only show the user input in the paragraph when the enter key was pressed. These are your tasks. Definitely try them on your own first. In the next video, in the next lecture, you'll see my solution, which you can use to compare it to yours. So, were you successful? Let's solve this together. In task number 1, we should show an alert with any text of our choice when this button is pressed. Now, first of all, we of course need to take control over this section so that we then, in a second step, can add an event listener as we learned it to this button. So therefore, we're going to do something we did many times before already. We're going to create a Vue app. So for that, here in app.js, we simply call Vue create app. We can store that in an extra variable or constant. We pass our config object to the app. And of course, we want to mount the app and connect it to the HTML code. And here I'll connect it to this section, which already has an ID of assignment. So we can select this with hashtag assignment using a CSS ID selector. Now here on this button, we can use v-on to bind this to an event. And I want to bind this to the click event with v-on:click, and then define the code that should run. And here, as you learned, it's best to add a method. So here we add the methods key to our object config. And this then takes an object full of methods. And now in here, you can add any methods of your choice, or methods with any name of your choice, I should say. And I'll just name it show alert. Sounds like a logical name to me. And in here, I'll then show an alert with the built-in alert JavaScript function. So this is not coming from Vue. That's a built-in function available in vanilla JavaScript and hence also available here in Vue. And I'll just say this works, but of course you can use any text. And now we want to execute show alert when this button is clicked. So here we can point at show alert like this, or alternatively also execute it explicitly, which in this case doesn't really make a difference. But then if it doesn't make a difference, I personally prefer to just point at it, since this is closer to vanilla JavaScript. And if we now save that and reload, I can click show alert and I see this works alert. So that's task number 1 solved. Task number 2 is to register the user input on key down events on this input here and output in the paragraph here what the user entered. And event target value, like before, can help us with that. There's just one special thing about the key down event, which you'll see in a second. Again, we can use v-on, and now we want to listen to the key down event, which is another default browser event we can listen to. So a user event the browser is aware of, I should say. And now again, we could execute the code inline here, or better, point at a method that should be executed. And that's what I'll do. I'll add a new method here, name it save input. But again, this method name is up to you. And in here, I want to save whatever the user entered in a value, in a property, in a variable, which I can output in this paragraph. So for that, we need data. Methods allows us to define methods we want to execute, either on our own or implicitly through events. Data allows us to define the data we want to work with in this Vue instance. So here we should return an object, and in here we can then add, let's say, user input or whatever you want as a key, and initially store an empty string in here. And then here in save input, I'll set this user input equal to whatever the user entered. And for that, again, since this is a keyboard event on an input element, we can leverage event target by accepting the default event object the browser gives us. Event target then gives us access to the HTML element on which the event occurred, in this case the input, and then this input element has a value property which we can use to read the current value. And with that, we set the user input data property with this user input equal to whatever the user entered. Now we just need to point at save input here. And if we now save that and reload, I can enter max here and see nothing, because we probably should also output the input here. So here in this paragraph, we use interpolation to output user input. So to output this property and its value. And now if I reload, I can see what I enter. However, you'll notice one thing. there is a delay of 1 keystroke. And the reason for that is that the key down event is fired when the key is pressed, but not yet released. The value in the input here only updates once the key is released, or to be precise, once the key down event is finished. That's why we have 1 keystroke delay here. That's the only reason. But that's not a bug, that's just a key down event, and that's task number 2 solved. Task number 3 was to repeat 2, but only output the entered value if the enter key was pressed inside of this second input. So since we want to repeat what we did before, of course we can copy this first event listener for the key down event and add it on the second input as well. Here I will use the same method. We could also add a new method so that we also, update a different data property, a second one, which we could add on the second input. But here I'll reuse both the user input and the method. But I now want to make sure that the value we output here is only output if the enter key was pressed. And that's actually something I showed you before as well. We can have our confirmed input, which is also an empty string initially. And we can add a new method, for example, confirm input, where I want to set this confirmed input equal to this user input. And then here in this paragraph, with the double curly braces, I output confirmed input. So this new data property, which we're setting here, which I added a few seconds ago. Now confirmed input is output here, and we want to make sure that confirm input, this method, executes when the enter key is pressed in this input field here, in this input element. For that, we can again listen to an event with vOn. In this case, let's say the key up event, and then use an event modifier with the dot, for example here, the enter key modifier, to make sure that only if the enter key is pressed and released, whatever function we tie to this listener here is executed. So now I point at confirm input here, so at this method. And now this method is only executed if we press a key, but not any key, but the enter key. Now I'm going to restructure this to make it a bit easier to read with my shortcut here in the IDE, but that's the same code I just wrote, just formatted differently to be a bit easier to read. And if we now save that and reload, I can enter max here, and we see it updates in the first paragraph, of course, because there we're outputting user input, not confirmed input. But in the second paragraph, where we do output confirmed input, we see nothing. Only if I hit enter here, only then we output max in the second paragraph as well. And that's the assignment solved. That is all you need to know about events for the moment. With that, let's move on and let's dig deeper into Vue. So back in the project we worked on before, a bit simplified, I dumped the event modifiers, I dumped v1s, and you find this snapshot attached to this lecture in case you also want to start from, this state again. So I'm back in this project where we have this input element and the buttons for the counter and so on. Now let's say our goal is to have another button, maybe here below the input, where we say reset input. And the button should do what the name implies. It should reset the input in, the input element. For that, we can add a new method, reset input, or however you want to name it. And in there, how do we do that? In there, we now want to clear this input. Now, we could try to get access to the input through JavaScript with document query selector, for example, get access to the input like this, access the value property and set it to an empty string. This might actually work, but it's very hacky. We're not using Vue to then fall back to such explicit JavaScript instructions. That's not the idea behind using Vue. Instead, we want to stay in the Vue world and leverage Vue and its features for that. So, how could we do that? Well, we could use the name data property, which is the value we're ultimately updating on every keystroke, and output it here in input by setting value, the value attribute, equal to name. However, not like this, but instead, since name is dynamic and managed by Vue, with help of vbind. With that, I'm making sure that name is reflected here, so this name here is reflected in the input. Why am I doing that? Well, if I now go to reset input and set this name equal to an empty string, that empty value should be reflected in the input, and we should be able to set it back to an empty string. Now we'll have one problem with that, and that is that in setName, I'm not setting name to just what the user enters, but to what the user enters plus the last name, and that would lead to a strange behavior if we then reflect name back into this input here. I can actually show it to you. If I reload, you'll see if I start typing, Schwarzmuller gets added over and over again, which is not the idea. So for the moment, let's get rid of this last name, which we add here, and let's just store what the user enters with every keystroke in name, and then reflect name back into the input, so that there we really reflect what the user entered. And now let's also connect this button here with vOnClick to this newly added reset input method, so that this is triggered when the reset input button is pressed. And with that, if I now reload, I can enter max here, and it all works, but if I click reset input, we clear that. We also clear it in the paragraph, because there we're referring to the same name which we reset here, but that's just a little side effect here. Of course, if we wanted to prevent that, we could use a separate value which we output here, which we confirm upon hitting enter or anything like that. I showed this before, how we could work with two values, a confirmed input and a regular input, but that's not what this is about. Instead, what this is about the fact that this is a pattern you could need in some occasions. You might have inputs where you don't just want to get the value the user entered, but where you also want to set the value of the input so that you, for example, can reset it with a button or any other logic you have on your page. And you can then achieve this by not just listening to the input, but by also sending the stored value back into the input by binding the value property. This is a common pattern you could need. And actually, it's so common that you need something like this that Vue has a shortcut for this, you could say. It has a special built-in directive which simplifies this. If you bind the value and listen to input changes on input, you can get rid of all of that. So both of the value binding and the input event listening, get rid of both, and instead add a new directive on the input, the vModel directive. And this vModel directive now simply wants the data property it should manage for you. So in our case, the name property. The name property now is managed by Vue such that it's updated on the input event, and the name property's value is then sent back into the input element. So vModel is simply just a shortcut for vbind value and vOnInput. vModel is just a shortcut for this. And if I now save that and reload, we therefore get the same behavior as before, but with less code. And this is a concept called two-way binding, because we're communicating in both ways. We are listening to an event coming out of the input element, you could say, to the input event. And at the same time, we're writing the value back to the input element through its value attribute, through its value property. That's why it's called two-way binding, because we communicate in both directions. And this is useful It makes getting user input and updating it much easier, as you can tell. It's less code and therefore absolutely a pattern and specifically a directive you should keep in mind. So now at this point we know a couple of things. We learned about DOM interaction. And that's a complex term. With that, I mean that we learned how to make a part of the DOM the template of our Vue app by mounting the Vue app to it. We learned about data binding with vbind and string interpolation and also vHTML. And we learned about event handling with vOn, but also with vModel. To be precise, vModel is two-way binding and therefore the combination of data binding and event handling, so to say. Now it's time to dive into a third big block that makes up Vue. This block has no official name, but I like to call it advanced reactivity. Vue is very reactive. We already see that in a lot of places. When I type here, the name here updates and Vue does that for us. The same if we change the counter. So that all works. But we have even more features than what we know about thus far. And I want to start by coming back to methods besides using them with events, and then show you a better alternative to methods for certain use cases. Now, in this app here, we added two-way binding, but to add it, we had to get rid of our last name here. Now, that's not too bad because the way we made the entered name a full name by adding a last name wasn't ideal anyways. Using this setName method, passing in this argument, it worked, but as you see, as soon as you want to do more, for example, adding a reset functionality, it's pretty hard to implement it like this. That's why we had to get rid of it. But that's no problem. We can output a full name here in a different way. For example, we can add a new method. Anywhere where you want, by the way, the order of methods here does not play a role. So I will add it at the top. And I will name it output full name, because that's what this method should do. It should return something because I'm not going to use it to bind it to an event, but instead I'm going to use it to call it here in the curly braces. I want to call output full name like this. And therefore I want to get back the full name here, which then will be inserted in this part of the HTML code. And therefore here I want to return this name, which is the entered name. So this name property, which we're managing with vModel, plus a blank space, plus Schwarzmüller. And of course, this Schwarzmüller could also be fetched from another input. Here, it's simply hard-coded. And if I now save that and reload, we see Schwarzmüller here at the beginning. And if I enter Maximilian, we see Maximilian Schwarzmüller. Now, since I'm using a method, we can even add a if check and check if this name is currently empty. And if it is empty, we just return an empty string here so that we only add Schwarzmüller if the name is not empty. So here we leverage the fact that we're having a method to return different values based on different values in name. And with that, if I save this and reload, we make sure that we initially don't see anything and we only see full name with Schwarzmüller included if I did enter a real name. And as soon as that's empty again, the full name is gone. So that's pretty nice. However, it's not the best way of doing that. Now, why is that not the best way of doing it? Well, if I type here, we update the name and output it down there. That's good. The problem is, if I press this counter button, we don't see a problem, but behind the scenes, Vue does something which is not ideal. When we change the counter, Vue basically tries to find out where on this page it needs to update the rendered page. So for example, if the counter changes, Vue sees that in this paragraph we're using the counter and hence it needs to, well, update this part here on the real page. That's exactly why we use View. It updates the page for us automatically. The problem is, if we call a method like this here, this method will also be re-executed by View whenever anything on the page changes, because View can't know what this method does. It doesn't know whether maybe the counter gets used in there. Well, if the counter changed and this method maybe uses the counter, this method should be re-executed, right? Well, and for that reason, View goes ahead and re-executes any method you're using anywhere in your HTML code between curly braces or with vbind or with vhtml. So any non-event bound method will be re-executed by View whenever anything on the screen changes. Even if, like in this case, we know that in this method we're not using the counter. We know it, but View doesn't. And from a performance perspective, that's not so great. And we can see this, by the way. We can add a console log here, running again. And if I now increase this a little bit, open up the browser developer tools and go to the JavaScript console part, you will see that if I reload here, we see running again initially. But if I change the counter, we also see running again being executed over and over again, even though we just changed the counter. Still, output full name was executed again for the reasons I just specified. And that's not a bug, that's how View works. And that's why methods are not the best solution for outputting some dynamically calculated value like this. But what is a better solution then?